Hi everyone and welcome to the Empowered Jew podcast. I'm Chavi Israel, your host, speaking to you from Sydney, Australia. After October 7, I found myself in uncomfortable situations, not sure how to respond or navigate. That's why I created the Empowered Jew, first an organization and now a podcast to equip you with the knowledge, skills, and tools surrounding Israel and your Jewish identity. In each episode, we'll explore various topics from multiple perspectives so that you can feel informed, empowered, and proud of who you are. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Hello, Dr. Ron Weiser. Thank you so much for coming and being on the podcast. You are involved in many organizations. You are the member of the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency, life member of the Zionist Federation of Australia Executive, Honorary Life President of the Zionist Council of New South Wales, past President of Zionist Federation of Australia, which you led for 10 years, a founding and current director of the Y2YE 10 Israel Project, a founding and current director of SAJE, the Sydney Academy of Jewish Education. I feel like I'm not even touching on everything that you've done in your incredible career that is still not ending. I don't think it's ever going to end. But tell us a little bit about your journey and how did you get so involved in the community?
So it was just a natural part of my upbringing. Both my parents are Holocaust survivors from Slovakia. My mother in particular was very involved communally when they came to Australia. They met in Sydney, actually. They didn't come together, but like all migrant groups, they were in the same social groups and things like that. They met here. My mother is a survivor of Auschwitz. My father is a survivor also of the Shoah. It was just a natural thing that grew out of our family home. They're one of the founders. They were one of the founders of the Kuchi synagogue. They didn't own their own place, but they built a synagogue first. And that was just a natural thing for them to do. And I think that in particular, my mother's, who was home more, but even though she worked, had a greater influence on my communal life. She always was active in the community. And I think she always thought that the answer to what had happened to her and her family in Europe was to fight back. And I think that's been the basis of my Jewish identity.
Wow. Okay, so you are a Sydney boy.
Yep.
And are you a Mariah boy too?
No.
No.
Oh, my generation in Sydney didn't go to Jewish day school.
Oh, okay.
My generation in Melbourne did. It's one of the differences between the two communities. Oh. Another difference is that we're mainly here from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and then Melbourne mainly from Poland. Of course, these are gross generalizations. Mm-hmm. It was a very poor community then. And I think when I graduated from high school, I went to Ramick Boys High, but there was mincha said every day in the playground there. A third of the year was Jewish. Another almost two-thirds, almost the rest of them were Greek migrants. It was a school for migrants, and there were very few so-called Australians in inverted commas. But I think the year that I finished high school, in Mariah at that time there were only 12 kids in year 12. So it wasn't really yet, hadn't taken off. But my children and grandchildren go to Jewish day school. Well, my children went to Jewish day school. They don't go anymore. Yeah.
So I see where you got, community involvement. Yeah. But how did you get to the trajectory of like specifically focusing on Israel? I feel like Israel's your forte. How did you get to Israel?
So I think for Holocaust survivors, it's a very black and white, very simple equation. Look what happened when there was no state of Israel. And with the state of Israel, that can't happen. The Shoah just cannot happen.
Yeah.
You can have Jewish suffering, you can have bad things happen to Jewish people, but you just can't have the Shoah. So I think we're a small community. I mean, our whole community, if you rank Jewish communities around the world, there's, I think, 10 American cities which have larger Jewish populations than Australian Jewry. So we don't have economies of scale. We don't have the ability to do everything ourselves. And I think an Israel-centric identity was always the natural way to go. There was always an argument between Theodore Herzl and Asher Ginsburg, as to whether Israel should be the sole place Jews lived or should be just the center of the Jewish world. Culturally, it's almost like, and I think it's almost like a Jewish solar system, with Israel at the center and all the diaspora Jewry revolving around her, held together by that Jewish tug, and that's the Jewish gravity. And I think today, although it wasn't popular in the first 30 years of Israel's establishment, but I think today it's the common view that Israel is the center of the Jewish world. And and I think that's just a natural thing if you want to have a Jewish identity. Of course, it's broader than just being about Israel, but it's about what Israel represents, the homeland of the Jewish people, its cultural center, its historical center, its biblical center, and, every other description that you could possibly imagine.
So for you, Israel, it wasn't even a question. It was like obvious.
There was never a question in our household.
Yeah.
And the other thing was, because there was no Jewish day school, or very few, almost nobody went to Jewish day school, our parents, and this is, I think, true across the broad section of the community, sent us to youth movements because they wanted us to get a completer or a more complete Jewish education. Now, I happen to go to B'nai Akiva, which is where I met my wife. But, even my wife's family, who are from Iraq, and Sally, my wife, was born in India, they also have a story of the wandering Jew from Baghdad to Bombay to Bondi. And, the values were remarkably similar and always also centered around Israel as the anchor of Jewish identity and of the Jewish world.
Amazing. Okay, so you are very well known when it comes to anything to do with Israel.
Yeah. Well, I've been around for a long time.
You've been around for a long time.
I joined the Zionist Council at the age of 16, which was very young at the time. Maybe some people are not happy about it, but I haven't left.
Oh, don't say that. No. Okay, so you're an Israel whiz, and I actually today want to focus this podcast on unpacking something that maybe, and I'm even scared that I'm saying it wrong. I don't even know how to say it. The Palestinian state, the Palestinian entity. To be honest with you, it's a little bit confusing because I personally always thought that Palestinian people do have a state, even though I think it's an entity, but we'll discuss that and the difference, if there is even a difference. Because even in the Olympics, they had a team and they have their own number plate on their cars. And I know they hold, I think, Jordanian passports. Palestinian passports don't exist.
So the whole question is, what is a Palestinian state?
Yes. What is a Palestinian state?
First, let's go to the United Nations.
Okay.
There are two structures in the United Nations, the General Assembly and the Security Council. Resolutions in the General Assembly are non-binding. Only resolutions of the Security Council are binding. So this United Nations Security Council does not recognize the state of Palestine. The United Nations Security Council, with the big powers, have a veto. So we assume that America would exercise a veto as they have in the past, if the question came to the Security Council. But the General Assembly of the United Nations, as I think there's over 140 countries that say they recognize Palestine. The whole question of Palestinian passport, let's go back one step. Yeah. Where is Palestine?
Okay.
We don't know, right? It's generally described as the West Bank, Yudav Shomron, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. But there's no map of this actual place. And it's not as if Israel had internationally recognized borders before the Six-Day War. It was just an armistice line called the Green Line. It was called the Green Line because it was drawn with a green pen. There is no other significance to the word green. And when we talk about Lebanon, we'll be talking about the blue line, which was drawn with a blue pen. So there's no such thing. After the War of Independence, remember at the time the Palestinians, or then the Arab world, had rejected a two-state solution. And that's really the history of the whole conflict. Israel is always accepting a two-state solution. The Palestinians are always rejecting a two-state solution. Jordan took the West Bank and annexed it. This annexation was not even recognized by anybody in the Arab world. It was considered an illegal annexation. And generally the people in those areas are stateless rather than having Palestinian or Jordanian passports. They don't have Palestinian passports or Jordanian passports as much as they have travel documents. And you can have a travel document issued by Israel. You can have a travel document issued by UNRWA. You can have, until 1988, the Jordanians ruled that area and were issuing passports. But since 1988, said they have nothing to do, no sovereignty claims over the West Bank. So the Palestinians have put themselves into a limbo situation, but they can have travel documents from any of these places. It's a murky situation. Israel, after the Six-Day War, offered them citizenship. Of course, the Arab world urged them not to accept citizenship, so they didn't. The residents of Jerusalem have been offered citizenship. Some of them have residency papers. But when Israel treats them, I think, in a diplomatic sense, the actual individuals, more as residents rather than citizens. So they're effectively stateless. And I mean, for 100 years of Palestinian discontent, whether it was called Palestinian before or not, really not relevant anymore, is a result of their own inability to get their act together and their own unwillingness to make a deal with Israel. The irony of the current situation is that, as I said before, Israel has always wanted a two-state solution for two main reasons. One, because Israel is a democracy and wants to remain a democracy and wants to have a majority Jewish population.
Yeah.
Of course, if the entire Jewish population of the United States made Aliyah tomorrow, that would change the demographics, but it is about demographics. And the other one is security. Today, it's not really an ideological question. At the moment, we don't want to recognize that there might be a two-state solution because we don't want to reward terror. Ultimately, if there could be a guarantee that the state of Israel would have a secure situation, that its borders would be sacrosanct, that the Palestinians would give up all, not only territorial claims, but what they still claim the right of return, Israel would agree to it immediately.
I've heard many times Israel's tried for a two-state solution, we've tried for peace. Can you give us some concrete examples of that?
Well, if we go back to the United Nations Resolution 181, which was on the 29th of November 1947, it was the world's decision to divide that area into two entities. I mean, it had previously been ruled by the Ottomans for nearly 400 years, the Turks. They were thrown out by World War I, and the great powers at the time was Britain and France in the main, but also Japan and Italy, America as observers, decided to divide the area basically according to demographics, according to population. We accepted that. They didn't accept it. They started a war to annihilate Israel. And really nothing has changed. In the year 2000, if we skip, well, let's go to the Six-Day War, sorry. In 1967, immediately after the war, the government of national unity, which included Menachem Begin, was a Labour government, but included Menachem Begin, with the Likud were part of it as a national unity emergency government, offered the whole of Yehuda Shomron to Jordan, the whole of the Golan to Syria, and the whole of Gaza to Egypt, with the exception of Jerusalem. And they said no. And that's where we've been ever since 1967.
And what about before the Six-Day War? Was there also other times where Israel tried for peace or two-state?
Well, we had the 181 in 1947.
Yeah.
And then there was, I mean, at the end of the War of Independence, Israel didn't have the West Bank, it didn't have the Gaza, it didn't have the Golan. And for 19 years, it sat within those boundaries.
Yeah.
It had no desire to take any further territory, just to survive within those boundaries. So the real moves on a two-state solution only happen when it happens every time there's a war. Israel wins, Israel takes more territory.
Yeah.
And then they say, we recognize the previous result. But the real question is, it's two things that we have to, I think, be very clear about it. One is, can you territorially divide the area? The answer is very clearly yes, and it's always the Likud that divides it. Prime Minister Netanyahu, the first time he was Prime Minister was from 1996 to 1999, and the Labour Party in Israel spoke all the time about dividing Hebron, but they never did it, because they can't do it. Who divided Hebron? It was Bibi Netanyahu in 1997. And he divided it, 80% he gave to the Palestinian Authority, 20% kept for the State of Israel, and the same overlay master plan can be put on Yerushalayim as well. Because also with Yerushalayim, which borders are we talking about? You're talking about the British Mandate borders, you're talking about, what borders are you talking about? I mean, how big is Jerusalem? How small is Jerusalem? This is the problem in the Middle East, that without a map, you can't define an area. But it comes back to demographics. And Israel is always going to come down on the side, provided it can assure itself of security, which the last year has shown us is very difficult. It's always going to exceed land, and it's always going to be the Likud that does it. With Begin that made the deal with Egypt, you can with Sharon that went out of Gaza, it's always going to be the Likud, because they're the ones who can gather more support for such a move. And the truth is that from 1967 to 1977, the first 10 years after the Six-Day War, it was a Labour government, and they built the majority of the settlements. They built Gush Etzion, Ma'ale Adumim, and Ariel, because they built it according to a security plan to protect Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And that is the common agreement in Israel. And you'll see today, notwithstanding the extreme left and the extreme right, that the great majority of the population, they have no doubt about would they be willing to give up territory if they could get security. And the big question is security. And the history is the world, in order to quickly solve an issue, promises security and leaves. And any time Israel needs to go back and reassert, like Sharon after 2005, the disengagement from Gaza, said, if there'll be one rocket coming over, we'll go back in. And he never did. Israel also left the Philadelphia corridor between Gaza and Egypt back in 2005, saying they could come back any time, and they never can, because the world pressure says, no, let's have a deal. And I was listening to Penny Wong this morning, she's at the United Nations, and she condemns Hamas as a terrorist organization. She condemns Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, but she seems to think that they don't have support in the population. I mean, Lebanon declared 3 days of mourning, not Hezbollah. Lebanon declared 3 days of mourning at the assassination of Nasrallah. So, yeah, so it's all about getting security guarantees, and at the end of the day, only we can give ourselves security guarantees.
Okay, I've got so many questions, so much information. What I'm kind of understanding, I mean, it's very hard to say what's Palestinian area, I guess, but we would say that Palestinians have an entity. We wouldn't be able to use the word state. That wouldn't be the correct term. So entity, and their entity is more or less the West Bank, like you said, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip.
Not East Jerusalem.
Oh, so not East Jerusalem.
No.
Okay.
So their entity until October 7th was the Palestinians completely controlled Gaza, with the exception of external relations. And don't forget that Gaza had 2 borders, one with Israel and one was with Egypt. On October the 7th, after the horrible massacres that took place and the brutality of the way it was conducted, Israel's re-entered Gaza and controls Gaza today. In the West Bank, or Yudav Shomron, there are 3 areas: Area A, B, and C. In the idiom in Israel, A is Aravim, B is Biyachad, and C is a little play on the C is Shalano. So basically, post-Oslo in 1993, the Israelis and the Palestinians came to an agreement, again, and it's very important to understand, on demographic basis.
And the Palestinians agreed to this, or they didn't have a choice?
No, they agreed to it. It was part of the Oslo process.
Oh, okay.
There was a handshake, you remember?
Yes, that video. Well, I don't remember, but I've seen the video.
Handshake on the White House lawn.
Yes.
Clinton, Arafat, and Rabin. And Area A is exclusively Arab. Only Arabs live there. Only Arabs. And it's where most of the Arabs live, and it's all the Arab towns in the West Bank. They have full control over their own daily lives. The only thing they have no control of is the external relations. Area B...
Sorry, so Area A would be like Ramallah, for example?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
yeah.
The 5 major Palestinian cities, but also land as well.
Yeah. So
Area A is exclusively Arab, and Jews are not even allowed to enter. Jews are not allowed to enter by Israeli diktat, because they don't want them to become hostages, etc. So they don't even see Jews, right? They just go about their daily lives.
Do they work within Israel, by the way, some of them?
A lot of them work in Israel, but that's by their choice. So Area A is Arab. Area B is Biyachad, together. No Jews live in Area B. No Jews live in Area B. But Area B is jointly run by the Palestinian Authority and Israel. The Palestinian Authority are the authority in Area A and Area B.
Can you give us an example of a place that's Area B?
In none of the major cities, but it's usually areas between some of the major cities.
Like the Gush, kind of?
No. The Gush is part of Area C. Where all of the Jewish people live, and we don't really know, but somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 Arabs, and around 400,000 Jews. And Area C is mostly desert, and it occupies approximately 60% of the West Bank in land area. So it's not as urban as areas A and B. And that is completely under Israeli control, and that's where you find the so-called settlements, if you want to call them settlements. Gush Etzion is like the most settlement. It's the settlement most in the consensus. But Ma'ale Adumim, is in Area C. Ma'ale Adumim was established by Yitzhak Rabin. You'll always notice it was always the Labour Party that established the major settlements. But the only thing Israel annexed is Jerusalem. So we annexed West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem. For us, there's no West or East Jerusalem. So annexed means we said it's part of Israel.
Okay. So essentially, Area A, just Arabs. B, joint, which means
Joint
it's under
control.
the Palestinian Authority, really, but there's Israeli military presence.
Yep.
So would an example of that actually be Hebron? I go to Hebron every time I'm in Israel. I have a gorgeous Yemenite Temani family friends, and they live not actually in the 2% where Jews can live in tiny Hebron, but right on the outskirts in Kiryat Arba in a place called Givat HaAvot. They're actually next door neighbors of Ben Gvir, interestingly enough. And that little area of Hebron, I know that Jews are living there legally. Like, I know there's not many. There is a very, very strong military presence in Hebron. And then on Shabbat, we're allowed to go for a 1-hour Kasbah tour surrounded by the whole IDF. And we go into an area that officially is a Jewish area, but Jews are not allowed to live there. And it's a no man's land kind of. So with Hebron, I know it's maybe I'm getting into a whole other kettle of fish.
So I think,
would that be Area B?
I think it's, firstly, I can't, no, that wouldn't be Area B.
Oh, it wouldn't be Area B.
No, it would be Area C.
It would be Area C.
But I think that we can get too much into the detail of each little place.
Okay, fine.
And just like everything else with the borders of Israel and the borders of the Palestinian state and the borders of Area A, B, and C, the centers of each of those are well known. The borders are not well known. Even Gush Etzion, for instance, or let's talk about Efrat, which is the main town in Gush Etzion.
Yeah.
It's built on a certain number of hills, right? But some of the hills were declared part of Efrat by Efrat's municipal council before anybody was living on them. And then when they build on one of those hills, it becomes controversial because was it part of the original Efrat? Where are the boundaries of these areas? Now, people who are very pro the settler movement would give you a much more black and white picture than I'm willing to give you. But there's around 150 unauthorized, but not necessarily illegal settlements. And they tend to be always outliers of a previous settlement. So the settlers will tend to extend their settlement, sometimes calling it a different name, sometimes calling it Part B of their original settlement. And it's a murky area. There have been different people who've tried to map the area. But yeah, I wouldn't go into each little individual place. In general principle, the majority of the Palestinians live under Palestinian rule. The Jews that live there are Israeli citizens. We do have two different legal systems working in the West Bank, because if you're a citizen of Israel, you're under Israeli civil law. If you're not a citizen of Israel, you're under military law. So there are two different types of legal systems. But on the other hand, if Israel would extend civilian law to all of the Palestinians living in the West Bank, the world would give a complaint because they would say that was annexation. And so Israel has left these places in a greyish area. We call it the status quo. We always call it just the status quo. You'll find that it's very difficult to identify every little square inch of land as what it's actually part of.
Okay, and then what happens if a Palestinian and an Israeli, they're in the West Bank and they have a car accident? Like when we get to the actual nitty-gritties, like they're both under different laws. How does that work?
So it's very difficult. Firstly, before you mentioned that there's a Palestinian number plate, there's no Palestinian number plates.
Oh, there isn't?
There are number plates of each town. So Bethlehem will have a number plate which will have a bet there. It'll be one color.
Because it's different to the Israeli number plate. Like you can see the
Yes,
distinction.
and of course it's not a Jewish-Arab thing. It's an Israeli citizen, non-Israeli citizen thing. So 20% of the 20% of the population of Israel is Arab. They all have the same Israeli roads, but there are Israeli registration plates and so forth. There are no Jewish-only roads, but there are Israeli-only roads, and there are Palestinian-only roads.
Oh.
So, and the whole idea is that they don't come into conflict. But I was actually once looking after a group, And on Shabbat, outside of Neve Daniel, which is in Gush Etzion, a driver from Bethlehem ran a child over, an 18-year-old over. It was entirely the fault of the Jewish kid from Australia, had an open fracture in his leg. And the Palestinian from Bethlehem, it wasn't his fault at all. This kid just ran across the road at night. Stopped, and it could have been perilous for him because people could have thought he ran this kid over or whatever and helped the kid to help arrive. But the problem was claiming back any of the insurance costs, because how do you claim an insurance cost from someone in Bethlehem? So, of course, there's daily many such problematic issues. Shimon Peres once described it like, trying to separate the populations in the West Bank as trying to make eggs out of an omelette, the opposite of making an omelette out of eggs, because they live cheek by jowl in a lot of these places, and you get a lot of these incidents.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
So the thing is, just like with if you have a car accident here with somebody who has no insurance, you have to take your own insurance. That story shows a few things. One, just the daily difficulties, but on the other hand, it shows that at the human level, people can help each other.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we know what Israelis think because it's a democracy. We don't really know what Palestinians think. We know what their leadership thinks, and we know that, but we think circumstances can be changed. I mean, if 20% of the population of Israel, which is not Jewish, mainly Arab, can live and work and be happy in that state, and also choose not to go to any future Palestinian state because they understand that their rights are much better protected in the only Jewish state, I'm very hopeful.
Education is a huge part of all of this.
Look, their education is run by they have their own education system inside Israel. But you cannot go to Israel without bumping into a Haredi person, without bumping into an Arab person. I mean, most of the pharmacists, for instance, are Arab. I mean, COVID was fantastic from one point of view, because that was the first real time that the Jews and Arabs mixed together. They came to hospital. Most of the nurses are Arabs. There's a lot of Arab doctors. And they were looking after Jews, and Jews were looking after Arabs. It was actually very good. And what you see today is that for the first time in the history, the Israeli Arabs, at least until now, are seeing that their lot is the same as with the Israeli Jews, and they're not protesting, they're not rioting. They understand the situation very well.
Yeah, but I think that really comes also to their education.
In Haifa, which is a very mixed town, if a Jew doesn't want to see an Arab, they have to leave Haifa. If an Arab doesn't want to see a Jew, they have to leave Haifa, because you're running all the time into each other, working with each other. And I think that gives me great hope. But going back to your Palestinian state question, there's been many instances since 1967 that we've offered again a two-state solution. The outstanding two are one in the year 2000, the Clinton plan, one in 2008, the Ehud Olmert plan, even the Trump plan of 2020. There's been many instances. There's been one instance of the Arab world coming up with a two-state solution. And that was in 2002, and it was led by Saudi Arabia. It's another reason why Saudi Arabia is essential to the ending of conflict here. The problem with the Saudi plan was that how do you guarantee Israel's security, which we've said before, but the real bugbear is this issue of the right of return. So there's no such thing in the world today as a refugee if you're the grandchild of, or if you've been resettled, but as I said, if you're the grandchild of somebody who was a refugee. I mean, my parents were refugees from Europe.
I was going to say all Jewish people
came from refugees.
We came from refugees, and if we were Palestinian and it was the same system,
so they're the only people that claim that refugee status lasts for 5 generations or something. And they're still claiming a right of return. The right of return means that they will have the right to come back to the state of Israel, which will immediately mean there's no Jewish majority, which is the end of the Jewish state. So we have to be careful when we hear about a two-state solution. We need security and no right of return. And that's the two key things. So, and you'll see all the, Hamas and Hezbollah are not the same branch of Islam. Hezbollah is Shia, Hamas is Sunni, but they have the same aim, eradication of the state of Israel, not sharing any bit of land at all. So there's no point talking about a two-state solution until you've got a party that's willing to agree to it, and that you can guarantee that it can be. And then, of course, it's a matter of negotiation.
And then Going back to Jerusalem, because I'm still a little bit confused on the Jerusalem. It doesn't fit into either area A, B, or C.
No, it's part of Israel.
It's part of Israel.
We have a next Jerusalem.
When I was just in Israel now a few months ago, many of my taxi drivers were Palestinians, not Arab Israelis, and they came specifically from East Jerusalem.
Right.
So then how are they Palestinians if East Jerusalem where they're living is under Israel?
So what is, just as that I like to say, nobody can draw a map of Israel.
Yeah.
Nobody can draw a map of Jerusalem. Where does East Jerusalem begin and end? Is Abu Dis part of East Jerusalem or not?
I don't know.
There's 200,000 Arabs approximately living in Abu Dis and the area around it, and I think 30 Jews. Well, there was a joke in Israel, Abu Dis, Abu Dat. But Abu Dis is not part of the annexed area of East Jerusalem. So when Israel annexed Jerusalem, it offered the people their citizenship. But the people again were pressured by their own side not to accept it. But that's at one level. At another level, just like you can be a taxi driver from Bethlehem, you're a taxi driver from East Jerusalem who's not an Israeli citizen, you'll have a different number plate. Or you'll come across the border and work for an Israeli taxi company, because thousands and thousands of Palestinian workers come from the West Bank every day to work in Israel. It doesn't matter what their status is. You don't have to be an Israeli to come across and work in Israel. So they'll go through a checkpoint, as you know, and if you go through a checkpoint, you'll show your papers. So your papers will either show you as an Israeli, or they'll show you as a East Jerusalem or a Bethlehem or a Ramallah resident.
Okay, so they're not here and they're not there.
That's
specifically right. I guess Palestinians in general, but specifically the ones also living in Jerusalem or East Jerusalem, because but where do they let's say they have a problem. I don't know. I guess when it comes to medical issues, Israel's very good to everyone. But let's not say a medical issue. I'm trying to think of
I'll give you an issue.
Okay, give me an issue.
Water. That's one issue. So the part of Israel, a part of Jerusalem that Israel has annexed, Israel would generally ensure that the water supply is like the rest of Israel. The part that it hasn't annexed, it's up to the area, to the local council, to see what it can do about getting the water there. Israel has a problem in that even the 20% of Israelis who are not Jewish, who live in Israeli Arab towns, don't have the same level of infrastructure as the Jewish towns.
And they're technically
they're Israel. Yeah. So, again, Likud, more than Labour, has had successive policies, and one of Naftali Bennett's policies when he was the Prime Minister for the short time that he was to improve Arab infrastructure in Israeli Arab towns. And similarly, the Mayor of Jerusalem, because the Mayor, if you think about it, there's not a Zionist majority in Jerusalem. You've got 1/3 Haredim, 1/3 Arabs, and 1/3 Zionists. So there's always, or often, a good coalition between Frum Jews, religious Jews, and Frum Arabs. They work very well together. So the Mayor of Jerusalem, because we don't have state governments in Israel, so the councils are more powerful than the councils in Australia. When he goes for election, he's promising the Arabs of East Jerusalem better water, better paved roads. I mean, you can walk through the old city and you can tell when you're leaving the Jewish quarter and when you come into the Arab quarter. It just looks different. One's more modern, the roads are better paved. So that's part of in the democracy. Remember, they don't pay much tax either, those people, right? You don't pay tax, you don't get services. It's not such a simple thing.
And meanwhile, the Jewish areas, they do pay more tax.
Of course.
Yeah.
So, you don't see too many Israeli tax inspectors going to the shuk, right, and try and work out what their income is. So you don't pay taxes, you don't get services. It's not even vicious, but it's a cycle. And I think, again, that it's in Israel's interests, and I think that Israeli politicians, in the main, understand that it's in Israel's interests, that if you want the citizens of the country to be happy and peaceful and quiet, you need to deliver them services. So the Israeli Arab political parties, which also come from the Muslim Brotherhood, have changed their tactic, recognized Israel as a Jewish state, But now are arguing for a better share of the resources of the state. And you're finding that most Israeli politicians agree that that's what should happen. But with the allocation of resources comes responsibilities. You have to register, you have to submit a tax return, you have to pay taxes, because Israel is not keen on giving services to people who are not paying anything to get those services. So that's the cycle that is going around, but I think it's improving dramatically. And the current mayor of Jerusalem is very well known for trying to improve the infrastructure and the basic services, garbage collection. You're talking about things that we take for granted here, but roads, garbage collection, water supply, to all of the people that live in the wider area of Jerusalem, whether they're Israeli citizens or not.
Okay, the Palestinians that live in Jerusalem, they're not Israeli?
Some took Israeli citizenship, but it's a minority. Most of them are residents.
They're residents of, I guess they would say,
they're
the
residents
old city
of East Jerusalem.
or East Jerusalem.
And
Israel, but it's not Palestinian per se.
But correct. But Israel is the authority that would usually issue to residents of East Jerusalem the travel documents.
Got it. So if they need to go overseas or whatever, they'll go to
They'll go to Ben Gurion.
Okay.
And they'll go with an Israeli issued travel document. Which is not a passport. And everybody recognizes that. So when you have the soccer team of Palestine go overseas, they'll usually go on Israeli travel papers.
Or even the Palestinian team in the Olympics.
Yeah.
It's funny.
So, but I mean, some of them still have their Jordanian passports. Some can go through Oman. They'll go in different ways. It's everything is grey.
Yeah.
So it's about time that we, the Jewish people, that's what I've been saying for quite some time, decide what we want and then work according to that rather than let the status quo overtake us. Yeah. Because we've been in the status quo since 1967. But our friends on the other side of the armistice lines and whatever don't allow us that luxury because they still produce fanatical terrorist groups. And I think our real hope is that Arab countries, Sunni Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, eventually Saudi Arabia, etc., will come in and force the Palestinians to accept a deal. That's why Saudi Arabia is such a goal now. But, they've been educating their population, these Arab countries, for 100 years, that Jews are the devil. So it's hard for them to all of a sudden turn around and say, we're going to make a deal with them. And they've all got
education.
Well, that's what it comes down to. And all of them have population. They're not democratic countries. They're despotic rulers, most of them. Don't observe many human rights. And they don't want revolution in their own country. So they're willing to distract by having the revolution against us. Which brings us to what happened in these last 2 weeks.
Yes.
So in the year 2000, Israel and Lebanon came to an agreement under the supervision of the United Nations about where their border is. They used a blue pen, so it's called the blue line. And unfortunately, they used a thick pen. And it sounds weird, but when they drew this line, Israel even moved some of its defensive positions just 100 meters because it had to comply. And they complied, and Israel withdrew from Lebanon in 2000. And then in 2006, Hezbollah launched an attack on Israel. And we have to remember that Hezbollah is part of Lebanon. As well as part of the Lebanese parliament. They're the largest party in the parliament today, which means that Lebanese people voted more for them than for somebody else. And there was a United Nations resolution of the Security Council, which is a binding resolution, that to end that war, that the Hezbollah would have to remove itself from the border with Israel and go to the Litani River. The Litani River is 20 or 30 kilometers from the border, so that there will be no Hezbollah presence. The United Nations put in a peacekeeping force, an observer force, which completely failed. And since 2006, Hezbollah have come closer and closer to the border, which then resulted in, after October the 7th, on October the 8th, Hezbollah launched rockets, and Israel had to evacuate 60 to 70,000 citizens from its northern area and has tolerated the situation for a year. It's a demonstration of what happens when the United Nations makes an agreement that can't be enforced or that it can't enforce. And then how do you go back and undo it? So now when Israel is, everybody, the Western world said Israel is entitled to self-defense, but then every act of self-defense it decides is a war crime. So until 2 weeks ago, Israel had lost its deterrence, or it's all about perception, right? It's not that it had lost its deterrence, but it was perceived to have lost its deterrence.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the people I follow in Israel very closely is Micah Goodman, and he likes to say that, Israel needs to be loved by the West and feared by the Middle East. And it's because Western perception is different from the Middle East perception. But Israel lives in the Middle East, and you have to be able to survive in the jungle there. So the United Nations makes a resolution, ends a war in 2006, everybody separates, and slowly, for nearly 20 years, Hezbollah violated that United Nations resolution. It didn't result in, Penny Wong didn't condemn them for this.
Of course.
It didn't result in Israel being able to go back into Lebanon or anything like that. And for nearly a year now, we're almost coming up to the anniversary, Israel has absorbed the rockets that are coming in and displaced its residents. And some of those places up north are ghost towns. And now in the last 2 weeks, Israel showed, firstly, the big difference between Lebanon and Gaza. It shows that its intelligence was amazing. Its ingenuity was unbelievable.
Yeah.
Its will to do something about it was shown to be, its resolve to do something was shown now dramatically. And that sends a very strong message to the Arab countries around Israel that Israel is back. I think that Israel had invested a lot in intelligence in Lebanon, but had thought Gaza was settled because Hamas were under control as long as we helped them to stay in power there, which is exactly what we did.
Yep.
And I think the biggest thing, though, that this last 2 weeks has shown is that it has re-engendered trust by the Israeli population and belief in its army.
And I wouldn't even say just the Israeli population. I would say for me as a Jew in the diaspora, I mean, I know Israel never officially claimed responsibility for the whole deepest thing, but it was Israel.
Well, that's part of the 2 weeks. So I don't know if Israel was or wasn't responsible.
Okay, but I finally felt like, okay, this is the Israel that I know. This is the Israel that I trust.
They show their ingenuity.
Yes.
And they showed that the deterrence is back. But they showed also, one of the question marks until October the 7th was, has Israel got too soft? And has the population in Israel, the next generation, your generation, can they really do what's needed to defend the state of Israel? And I think that what October the 8th and so on showed from then was that they're at least the equal of any previous generation and probably even better. And the new generation is just magnificent. The way they turned up to fight in their numbers, the way they've continued fighting despite all of the troubles and problems it causes their families and their jobs and everything, they've done it. But the question was, could they have trust in their leadership, that the leadership had the smarts and the capability, and also the political level? And I think that that's what this 2 weeks has shown. It's shown that those boys and girls who are fighting, and they're not all just boys and girls, there's many older people as well, that Israel is capable of defending itself and taking the fight to the enemy. And I think the psychological motivation is something 100%. That is going to just, everybody, I think, is saying, wow. Even the people, begrudgingly, who don't support what Israel did say, wow, look what Israel can do. And nobody's done anything like that. I mean, it was just unbelievable. For instance, and I'll give you the one big example, we know that on October the 11th, just 4 days after October the 7th, Israel knew where Nasrallah was. The military came out with a plan to assassinate him, but the political echelon said no. And now they said yes. So I think that's going to restore quite a lot of trust, not necessarily in the political leadership, but in the military leadership, but even in the political leadership. I mean, there's no one who gives better speeches than Bibi Netanyahu. His speech at the United Nations was amazing.
I watched that too.
They probably thought that whilst he's there, nothing will happen.
Yeah.
I mean, there'll be repercussions and we'll pay a price. But, I mean, the real question is, Hamas and Hezbollah are not independent organizations. They're all just tentacles of Iran. And the real question is, what is Iran doing? It's threatening, but it's quiet. It's threatening, but it doesn't do anything. Is it just biding its time? Or is it not capable of doing what we actually thought it might be able to do? And Netanyahu made it very clear that if Iran attacks Israel, Israel will attack Iran. And now I think people understand that Israel has that capability and that determination. So I think that changes the equation quite dramatically.
I agree. I heard the rumors yesterday on Shabbos that Nasrallah was killed. I remember when I was in school, we used to sing Yalla Ya Nasrallah, and it's whole it was like a little
after the 2006 war.
So you see, I just know the name Nasrallah from that song, from that little chant that I didn't even know what I was saying.
Those songs.
Okay, so I didn't even know what I'm saying. I just know it.
I don't like those songs because, here we were cheering about Nasrallah's demise in 2006 and it took till 2024 to do it.
Yeah.
Better do stuff and talk less than the other way around. But, Nasrallah will be replaced. Just like Sinwar will be replaced, and they've replaced previous people. But I think that's less important than the fact that Israel showed that even at a time when it used up a lot of the goodwill from the world, it was still willing to take these daring actions, and it could do it with such precision. And it's just with such a great intelligence capability. I don't know if the beepers yes or no, but those beepers were an amazing thing. And this has been a coordinated 2 weeks where Hezbollah just don't know where to turn. And I think that going back to Micha Goodman, you need the Middle East to fear Israel. I think this has restored that respect and fear of Israel.
Yeah. And do you think that Israel, perhaps, we care a bit too much what our allies think?
No. I think we have to care what our allies think because Israel, at the end of the day, is just about to pass 10 million in population. It's a third the size of Tasmania. We don't have the resources. Those were American planes. Those were American bombs that Israel was using now. Just this last week, Biden passed another $500 million worth of defensive weapons for Israel to rearm Iron Dome and David Sling and the Arrow. I think we do have to care what our allies think, and the more friends we have, the better. But at the end of the day, sometimes we'll have to disappoint our allies. And sometimes we'll just have to do what we think is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think that will bring us greater respect from our allies as well, rather than less respect. So I think we do need to care. And also, we don't want to be a pariah state. We don't want Israel to be, shunned by the whole world. That's why it really hurts the way the Australian government is doing what it's doing. As Golda Meir said, I'd rather be pitied and alive than respected and dead. And at the end of the day, if there's enough trust inside the population in Israel, then we're strong enough to resist the pressures of the world. Because at the end of the day, America, Australia, and Britain, and all these other countries understand that it is in their self-interest to support the state of Israel. So they have domestic populations, they have to make noises, we don't know what's going to happen in the American elections. But I heard Greg Sheridan today, by the way, speaking on a program on ABC. Sheridan's the foreign editor of The Australian. And he said it was a masterstroke in timing as well, because it tied Harris into supporting Biden. And they came out and said it was justified. And at the end of the day, the Hezbollah has been responsible for killing thousands of Americans, not just Jews or anything like that. So we have to care and we have to work for that. But I think at the end of the day, we have to have our own self-interest very clear, understand what our own red lines are, and act accordingly. And I think in these 2 weeks, Israel's demonstrated that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it's so important that when you respect yourself, people respect you. Personally, when I have boundaries, people respect that. And I think that Israel, perhaps from what I hear and feel maybe, but I feel like sometimes Israel is caring a bit too much what the world thinks about her. And sometimes Israel just needs to think about herself and set those boundaries and do what's best for her and not always trying to please her allies.
Well, I agree 100%. But I actually think that Israel spends more time trying to, that's a democracy, you have to keep a coalition government together. Bibi has a narrow coalition. Every party or any party in the coalition can bring his government down. He hasn't got a comfortable majority. And I mean, it's very interesting. I don't know if it's true, but for instance, the news reports today say that Smotrich was against the killing of Nasrallah at this point in time because he thought it would take the focus from Gaza. So sometimes they're not ideological questions, but they're tactical questions. But at the end of the day, Netanyahu he's an incredibly clever politician, and he has to thread that needle between all of his coalition partners. There are many internal issues.
I'm sure.
And I think that we need to decide as a people on those internal issues. Will the Haredim serve in the army? Will it be compulsory? He's got two Haredi coalition partners. What do you do about the Ben Gvir and the Temple Mount? Is Ben Gvir right? Is Ben Gvir wrong? What do you do about Smotrich? I mean, one of the ironies is that, if a Palestinian, you asked about workers before, if a Palestinian worker comes across to work from the West Bank into Israel, or as they used to come from Gaza, Israel collects the tax and gives that tax to the Palestinian Authority. Now, that wouldn't happen in Australia. If somebody from New Zealand comes to work in Australia, you work in Australia, you pay tax in Australia.
It goes to the Australian government.
So this is one of the aid questions. So Smotrich was withholding aid. He's the finance minister. He was withholding the tax. So is that a wise policy or a bad policy? The problem is if you withhold the tax, then the people become more desperate. Palestinian Authority just called for the removal of Israel from the United Nations. Abbas gave a speech this week. Everybody's giving speeches in the United Nations General Assembly. At the same time, we're in this plus-minus relationship with him where he goes into Area A and keeps peace and finds before a terrorist leaves Area A to come and do a suicide bomb in Israel, right?
Yeah.
So do we give them the tax money or do we not give them the tax money? These are difficult questions. What lesson does he learn from that? He learns he can both throw bombs at us
and still get the tax money.
Pay terrorist families a stipend and still get the tax money.
It's crazy.
It's crazy, but that's the crazy environment we're in. I think we have to stop looking at it with Western eyes. We have to look at it with
Middle Eastern eyes. Because we're in the Middle East and we're dealing with Middle East.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so interesting. And also all these different perspectives. I've read many Palestinians look at the Palestinian Authority, ironically enough, as Israel's puppet. Depending on your perspective, like I would say, what are you talking about it? They hate Israel, but then from a Palestinian perspective, they're Israel's puppet. So, or maybe they're a bit of both.
They're a bit of both.
They're a bit of both, yeah.
He also is trying to survive,
well,
right?
How long has he's been nearly in leadership for 20 years or something?
So he went to an election, got elected, and then stopped having elections since then. So they're not a democratic authority.
Definitely not.
But democracy is a weird concept in the Middle East. Ariel Sharon, when he was Prime Minister of Israel, he's like, if you read, Leon Uris's books, there's the Exodus, but there's the Hajj, Sharon features in these books. And Sharon understood exactly Arab mentality. So when he wanted to carry a serious message to Yasser Arafat, he sent his son. The Israeli said, that's the wrong way to go about it because the son's not even elected and you should send like the foreign minister or some, elected person.
He's so smart.
But he understood that Arafat has no idea what democracy is, but you send your son, you're sending somebody who you trust. So Sharon also walked that line where he operated completely democratically, and the message he was sending was the message that the government wanted to send. It wasn't his, a lone message, but he knew for Arafat to take it seriously, it had to come from his son.
Yes, he understood how they work.
And there was a famous case where Israel tried to assassinate a Hamas leader in Jordan. Bibi Netanyahu was prime minister. The Jordanians were embarrassed by the situation and they asked Sharon to come and bring the antidote. Not because they liked Sharon, but they understood Sharon. So, it's a weird area.
It's weird. Oh my gosh.
But I think that Israel now understands very well the era. I think that another plus that occurred post October the 7th was the whole Jewish world as well, or at least the great bulk of it, and the great bulk of the Israeli people understand that it's not about the territories, it's not about 1967, but it's about 1947. It's about an Israel of any size. And that's something that the Australian government doesn't understand at this point in time and says, two-state solution. The problem is you need two parties to that. So I think that there's a lot of, as terrible as October the 7th was, I think that it's made it very clear to Israel what it needs to do to stay alive in that area, and that's exactly what it's about. And really, it's not even just staying alive. You go to Israel, it's growing, it's building, the cranes are everywhere. You know, it's impossible to understand how in 75 or whatever years this country has grown, and the area around it hasn't. So they understand that, they're jealous of that, they want it, and I think that's another positive. But the main positive being that we're united. We're much more united than we were 20 years ago during the Second Intifada. We're united by reality. And we were mugged by reality, but I think that this time there is that reality. There was a shocking article in the Herald last week by Louise Adler, who's a major Melbourne publisher, and I saw that a person who responded was a Jewish eminent lawyer from the Great Synagogue, a member of the Great Synagogue, who had previously been on the board of the New Israel Fund. It's so much more powerful when he responds to Louise Adler than I would respond to Louise Adler or something like that. So I think that the lines are much clearer now, and I'm very optimistic about the future.
Yeah, I'm optimistic about the future. I just really hope that this unity stays. I know that unfortunately what brings us close together is our enemies. I know that people say majority of Aussies, firstly, most of them don't care, don't have an opinion. But I guess the loud voices that we hear, especially on campus, as Jews, we don't feel as comfortable as we did before October 7.
So you don't feel as comfortable because you're younger than me. And what you didn't witness is all the terrible events that happened here in Australia for the last 50 years. Every time that there's a conflict in Israel. In 1974, Jews were beaten on campus with iron bars. August, the Australian Union of Jewish Students, faced a national student union which took unanimously around the country anti-Israel resolutions. In 1982, 2 bombs went off in Sydney. One in the Israeli consulate in William Street. You just go down William Street quite happily, not knowing that there was a bomb that went off there.
No idea.
And later that afternoon, it was on the 23rd of December. Later that afternoon, a bomb was found in the boot at the Hakoah Club.
Yes.
Coinciding with the first Intifada from 1987 on, but really in the early 1990s, 7 synagogues were firebombed. The Central Synagogue, Sephardi Synagogue, Linfield Synagogue, Molotov cocktails. None of that's happened now. In 2003, we had the whole government, the state government, Bob Carr, and this whole episode with Hanan Ashrawi and the Peace Prize, where we had Sheikh Halali was the chief mufti of New South Wales. We were under threat. I received many death threats. These were billboards that went up in Sydney and Melbourne. Zionism is fascism.
Crazy.
But there's a picture, a photo
of
me
you
with an X through my head because I was president of the Zionist Federation.
And what does it say on top? Ethnic cleansing?
Apologist. Because I supported the Sharon government. We got death threats at home. We got death threats in the surgery. Oh. So I see the big difference now is social media, which has made it more immediate and magnified. But I think even your generation will agree that social media today is in a worse position in terms of respect than it was a year ago. And the second thing is that I find really fundamental change is there's an entire party, the Greens, who are anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And we haven't really been in that situation before.
That's actually a very scary situation.
That is a scary situation. But I think that the pendulum has swung back again within the Jewish community. We don't have the the numbers, but we have a lot of allies. The fastest growing population in Australia are the Hindus, and they're our allies. The state government passed an anti-swastika legislation with their help. They sit in the same electorates that a lot of the Muslim voters sit in. I think that we're not in as bad a situation as we've been in, but I think we've got to take this broader perspective that this is not new. It's a different form. It manifests itself in a slightly different way. Thank God, and again, I can only say till now, we don't know what will happen. There haven't been any serious incidents of violence, of personal violence, which we have had in the past. It could happen here. I know that the ASIO is expecting a higher level of alert now, particularly around the Chagim. I think that's just as Israelis have recognized that they live in the Middle East and that's their lot. I think as Jews, we're a minority. We have to recognize that that's our lot here, and just sitting back at home complaining and get out and do something about it. And a good example of that is the recent council elections that just took place.
Yes.
So I think we should take our victories where we can take them. I think one of the things you're doing is a very good example of the positive things that happened. In the past, it was just the leadership that was always expected to be there, but social media has its good and its bad, and this is one of the good things. And you influence, or reach out to a segment of the population. I mean, the series that you did at Tzemach Tzedek, I would say a lot of those people would not normally come to a general communal function or event on Israel. And I think these grassroots initiatives are extremely positive. So we just need to do more of them.
Amazing. I love that. I love ending on a positive note. And I think that there is hope, and hope is a fundamental part of us as a people, and we need to have that hope.
Listen, we've lasted for 3,000 years, okay? So there has to be something. But what's exciting for me is that for the first time in 2,000 years, we have a Jewish state, and we have an ability to determine the Jewish future. That's what I always define Zionism as, whether you live in Israel or you live outside of Israel.
Yeah.
And I think that we should spend more time working out how we want Israel to look, how we want the Jewish world to look. Otherwise, other people will decide it for us. So we need to move beyond just about the conflict. And we've got to work out how we don't want to merely survive. My parents survived the Shoah, but then they built a life. And I think that now we've got to get into this building a life scenario.
Yeah.
And how should Israel look? If you and me will have completely different ideas of how the Jewish future should look, that's not a problem. That's a really good thing, as long as we respect that we both want a better Jewish future. And I think that if the debate doesn't descend back into, leftists are bad, rightists are bad, or whatever, all these people have a view of how they think Israel should look. But we haven't had that luxury of determining that ourselves previously, and now we have that luxury. So we should use it.
I think it was really interesting because for me, you're right. For me, this is my first time, I guess, in my memory of experiencing what I would say is anti-Semitism, whether it discloses itself as anti-Zionism. I've had a few really uncomfortable situations where someone has said to me, "F you Jew," and a few other times, "My last name is Israel," and I've gotten looks. So it wasn't that I ever felt really scared or frightened for my life, but it was uncomfortable. Do you have a message to the new generation specific, or?
I think before October the 7th, I would have had a message to encourage you to do things. I think now my only message is just keep doing what you're doing. Because as I said before, it's not only the next generation in Israel that turned up, it's the next generation of Jews around the world. The protests have united us much more. The campus activities united Jews in a way that American Jewry hasn't been united for most of my life about Israel. And I think that the next generation proved itself and doesn't need advice from me.
You're very humble, Dr. Ron.
No.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I've learned so much.
All right,
so
thank
you. And Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.